We have a great group of people who are going to be speaking tonight. Some of you know, some of whom you've not yet met, but you will. We have Representative Lydia Crafts from District 46. See, told you I was going to screw it up. 46. We have Cameron Reny, Senator from District 13. We have Holly Stover, who is the representative from 48. Got that one right. And we have Lane Sturtevant, who is here from the League of Women Voters of Maine. You know the other three, but Lane is this is the first time that you've met Lane. They are an organizer with Democracy Maine, a statewide organization that consists of the League of Women Voters of Maine, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and Maine Students Vote. That is a lot of important groups there. In addition to their role as organizer, Lane is the program lead for Democracy Maine's local government work and co-facilitates its racial justice and equity team, and they live in Warren. We are happy to have all of you here today. Our legislators are going to talk with you about some of the bills that they've worked on so far this session, some of which passed and are now law. We have 12, our legislators passed 12 bills that are now law, written by these three people right here, which I think deserves a round of applause. And they're going to talk with you about some of the legislation. Some of it has passed, some of it did not fare as well as they hoped, and they're going to explain that. And some of it has been carried forward to the next session, which will start in January. And then Lane is going to talk with us about the 4 constitutional amendments that are on our ballot for November 7th. I know there are some referendums on the ballot as well, some of which have been getting almost all the attention. And I just want to make sure folks know, and you saw the email today, that we're holding a community conversations event on Thursday, October 5th. That's a week from today. It's going to be at the American Legion Hall in Damariscotta. I believe it starts at 6 for social time, with a hard start at 6:30 of the actual forum itself. We have speakers who are going to be here from Our Power, which is the organization that supports Question 3 to create a consumer-owned utility. And we're going to have people from Maine Clean Energy Coalition, which is the organization that opposes Question 3. The whole event is going to be moderated by Bill Harwood, who is the Maine State, what is his title? I have it right here. Thank you, public advocate. He is an impartial, and I've heard he's moderated several of these around the state. I've heard it's wonderful. This is free and open to the public, so we hope that you will come next week. This is just a very short hit list of the successes that we had this past year. Some of these were passed as part of the budget. Some of these were individual statutes. And most of these, I'm sure you've already heard. Paid family and medical leave, expanded community college for 2 more years for graduates, increased funding for the Children's Health Insurance Program. We protected access to gender affirming health care. We expanded Maine's child tax credit to support Maine families. You can read all of these up here. There are so many more accomplishments. This is how you see that elections matter. This is what happens with your vote and all the work that you all put in last year to elect these 3 people who are sitting in front of us. And I'm going to turn this over to Lydia now. You can stay seated. Who's going to talk about some of her bills.
Thanks, Kelly. It's great to see everyone turn out on a Thursday evening. Okay, great. 1975. A lot of my work in the legislature has been around substance use disorder and how the state addresses substance use disorder prevention, treatment, recovery services, and harm reduction. 1975 is a bill that I put forward last year and was carried over, which just means it hasn't had a public hearing yet. It's going to the Health and Human Services Committee in January and will be heard by that committee then. This bill does some dramatic things, and it's a good example of trying to build momentum for the direction we want to shift up an area of policy that may not be attainable in one cycle, right? There's lots of great policy we've worked on in Augusta that has taken several cycles to make it to fruition. So this bill, 1975, looks at shifting the narrative of addressing substance use disorder away from the criminal justice system, which is how we've intervened in many ways across history, to shifting it towards a public health narrative. And it creates a fund that would follow the public health districts, and that fund would be allocated to each public health district to provide comprehensive supports across the state that reach all of the geographical areas of our state, to provide really thorough wraparound services that are community driven and centered in each of our communities. Again, prevention, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services. As part of that bill, it also decriminalizes the possession of scheduled substances. As you can imagine, decriminalizing possession brings out a lot of opinions. A lot of people have ideas about this. I'm working with local law enforcement, with Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, across the state with the Maine Sheriff's Association, to talk about how are we shifting the way we address addiction and substance use disorder in our state towards a public health response rather than a criminal justice response. We know law enforcement, we know the Department of Corrections has a huge job in front of them, and they do a lot of their work very, very well. What I'm suggesting is when a parent calls me and says, how do I get help for my child who's struggling with addiction? The only thing I can think of is what I hear is to report them, right? Is to get them into a county jail or a prison, because I know they will have food and a roof over their head. And our DOC does a great job with medication assisted treatment, right? They'll get on Suboxone or methadone and they'll be safe and they'll be alive. And we are doing a phenomenal job compared to the rest of the country in the state of Maine in our state prison systems. What I'm suggesting is we should do a superior job outside of our prison systems to make sure that when a parent or a loved one wants to get help for their child, their family member, their friend, that those services are available in all of our communities. So that's what 1975 does. It hasn't had a public hearing yet, and there's a lot of strong response and opposition. I'm not surprised. I'm open. I'm willing to talk to anyone who has questions about it, what it would look like. And this is a journey, right? This is a path for this legislation. And it's not we're not at the end goal, right? We're looking at trying to shift the narrative. Next. This was an act to create the Recovery Friendly Workplace program. This bill died, and I was happy that it died because this program was funded and established through the governor's office by Gordon Smith and his department as the opioid response director. What had happened is it had gotten delayed, and it wasn't happening quickly. And folks who were trying to put in a recovery friendly workplace program in the state said, the state isn't moving quickly with this. And so I put in a piece of legislation to basically say, here, let's go. And as the timeline matched, the governor's office put $300,000 into the program. The contract went out. There was no need for this bill, right? I was happy for HHS to kill it because it was in existence. The state was already moving ahead with it. And there's a contract through the Pine Tree Institute. They have a relationship with the Portland Recovery Community Center. They're looking at expanding to 3 pilot programs in the state to help private sector businesses develop programming that supports employees who are in recovery or who are seeking recovery. So if someone needs access to a 12-step meeting on their lunch break, can they do employers understand that making an hour lunch break may be really important where it's common for them to have a 30-minute meeting? Are they supplying Narcan on site at the job site for folks who may be struggling with addiction? Right? How do employers look at creating a more recovery-friendly workplace to attract employees and to also support the employees that they have who may be struggling? As we know, the rates are extremely high. Okay, and then 1495, this is a bill around an act to establish a commission to study mining materials. For those who have followed the lithium bill that came across the House and Senate and passed, this was a bill that has been carried over, and I wanted to note it because I know nothing about mining. I know a little bit now. When I put this bill in, I knew absolutely nothing. But the reason I did so was because Peter Arnold came to me and said, I have this idea. I think that our state and our nation have a real need and demand for lithium. And we know there are very significant deposits in Maine, but how do we manage our environmental protections, our strict mining policies that the legislature worked extremely hard prior to us serving? how do we protect our natural resources, maintain clean drinking water, and look at our ability to mine minerals safely and effectively that are driving our climate goals. And so this study was not funded this year. I'm going to push for it to be funded next year through appropriations, and we'll see where it goes. But the importance of legislation like this is your representatives and senators are not, I can only speak for myself. I am not an expert. And there are issues that my constituents know far more about. And this example of lithium mining was a perfect one, that if you come to any of us with an idea, right, a solution to a problem you see in our state, this is what we can do. And it was a fantastic process for all of us. I think Peter would say the same, in getting to collaborate with other folks across the state who have similar priorities. So we'll see where it goes. It's not dead yet. And hopefully we'll get it across the line.
So the first bill that's up there is LD 18 or 816. And that bill has been carried over. And that is an act to provide integrated behavioral health services to sexual assault providers. So we have 7 sexual assault centers in our state. Ours in this area, in not just in Lincoln County, but in the Mid-Coast, is Sexual Assault Services of Mid-Coast, Maine. And this is to, I really go to pre-pandemic. There were a lot more community-based clinicians, both in private practice like Lydia is, but also at the community mental health centers. And post-pandemic, the availability of clinicians has diminished, especially in remote rural areas. In addition to that, treating sexual assault survivors, you really do have to have a lot of work, a lot of specialty around trauma-informed care. And also the continuity of relationship, because it's a very, working with a survivor, needs to be a very close relationship, because the trust and the violation that's occurred. And when you have a clinician at a mental health center that works for 6 months and then moves on, and that broken relationship, it's very hard to experience that longer term relationship. So the concept of this came through the Maine Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And the idea is we would embed clinicians within the sexual assault centers. So of the 7, there would be 7 positions. And it passed unanimously, I believe, out of committee. It was a tremendous amount of support for the concept that for somebody who is a survivor of sexual assault, who's experienced horrendous trauma, that it will be a long process, and that it's been very choppy. Back when I worked more closely in domestic violence and sexual assault, we had sheets that would have the list of clinicians in the community who are considered to be trauma informed and good at treatment. And now those people have left, and there's not really people coming in behind them. So this would solve that problem, but also provide better integrated care, more comprehensive care. And it would be based within the center, which would also be a support for the advocates and the other staff that work at the center. So again, it's carryover. I'm hoping because it would not be reimbursable. This would be part of the staff of the center, that we'd be seeking general fund dollars, but I'm going to remain hopeful that perhaps we'll get that funded. This bill, as I want to make you all aware, I worked in the Cross Office building a very long time ago. And I also worked in state government and would be called over to the Cross Office building because I used to do safety plans with state employees who experienced domestic violence, where it had a touch point to their workplace. So the Cross Office building is adjacent to the State House, and upstairs there are employees. So it isn't just a place where we hold legislative hearings. It is also an employment place, and every employee has the right to come to work and be safe. And it has been a longstanding problem in state government that employees that work in the Cross building are not necessarily safe. The best example I give is when I worked in state government, we had somebody, her estranged partner knew what time, he knew her schedule. He knew, and Mary Hanley will understand this story. He knew exactly what time she went to lunch. He knew how she went to lunch. She used the stairs. He waited in the stairwell. And her friend was walking with her, knew the story, but just kept going, right? And left her there. And when she got off to the next level, went out of the stairwell and got Capitol Police to come and it got intervened and taken care of. But the point is the building is not safe. On the lower level, there are meeting rooms, many meeting rooms. I've served in 2 different committees that meet in that building. There's Capitol Police, and there are 2 panic buttons, one for the Senate chair and one for the clerk. Those are the only 2 panic buttons in the room. And most of the rooms have 1 egress. They don't all have 2 egresses. So we are sitting in rooms, sometimes facing very angry people, and we have no security. And we had an experience in state and local government when we heard Article 5, which is the proposed Article 5 to amend the Constitution. We had a man who was very enraged, who was his appearance was, in my opinion, irrational, and he was targeting me. I don't have a panic button. I'm the House chair with no panic button, and my Senate chair did not assess that there was an emergency. He also targeted 2 of my committee members are African refugee women, and he also targeted them. So we had real live experience last session of a man in a committee room who, by the way, when he signed in, gave a false name, but we were able to work with Capitol Police and found out who he was, who also threatened us while he was in the room because he didn't think that we were listening enough to what he wanted. So the building isn't safe. The proposal is, and what has been funded under DAFs currently, and I haven't been on that side of the building, but it is under construction to create a security system. What didn't get funded, which is still on the carryover, are the positions, because you can have the best security system, like when you go into the State House, but if you don't have someone there, people to run you through, to take it through the scanner, we need the positions in order to make it work. So that's what we're still vying for. And then SNAP. So for those of you who remember, and maybe you don't, there was an ARPA bump, I call it a bump, a raise to the SNAP benefit, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, sometimes formerly known once upon a time as food stamps, which is has become an ugly word. So the SNAP benefit got raised during the pandemic. And the example I give is there was a woman in my office last January with a letter in her hand, and what had been a $265 a month benefit was going back to its original amount of $27. And she was in tears and she didn't know how she would do this. So I worked, first it was to try to do an emergency one-time supplemental benefit to all SNAP recipients. And that would be not impossible to do, but we couldn't get it out the door fast enough because of the way the session works. Since then, and it was a $46 million in order to do a SNAP benefit, and it would have become a permanent allocation. It's $46 million. I'm not saying I don't think it's a great idea, but we weren't able to move it along. Since then, what has happened, just like Lydia said, sometimes things happen once you put in a bill. The USDA, you may have heard, have done a raise to the SNAP benefit effective October 1st. And for a single person, it raises it back to around $270. And for a family of 4, up to $975. So it's better. And then the other piece of that, we have the Farm Bill. We won't get into the federal issues right now, but the Farm Bill has $50 per person per month. So that may or may not come into fruition. On the downside, what's being proposed right now is a 70% cut to the WIC benefit. And the WIC benefit includes cereal, milk, cheese, and formula. And so if we get a cut to so it's like you just feel like, oh gosh, there was really great news this week about SNAP. And then you get the other side. It's like, there's really bad news about WIC. So I don't know how that's going to play out over the next few days or any of the rest of it. But food insecurity still remains a chronic, severe problem in this state and in this county. So stay tuned on that. Oh, I had one other thing. I did want to mention, one of the things I said to Kelly when she was planning this is one of the things that we talk about is the outcome of the bills. And it's really important to understand that the work of a bill, the hours, the weeks, the months, the hallways, the nights, the weekends, the telephone calls, we put in hours as committees and we work really hard, and then things come to the floor, right? It is the committee work is such a huge part that we never talk about. And I saw instances this session where we had committees, all of us had committees who worked really, really hard. And there was one instance, I'm not going to say the committee, where the committee had a 12 majority to 1 vote, a person who didn't like, and brought that then to caucus. And this committee had worked extremely hard on something. It was my committee, but I read and I watched and I listened. And one person wanted to upend the whole thing because one person didn't like what the committee was going to do. But I really feel it's imperative, in my opinion, to support the committee work. The due diligence of a bill occurs nights, weekends, hallways with the 173 lobbyists that are wandering around, with everybody who cares about the bill. And I just want to recognize that the committee work is something that is so critical to the whole process, and the end result is the floor. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's me, Cameron Rennie. What are we doing first? 724. Oh yeah, the Rural Affordable Rental Housing Program. Hi. This one is great. This is one much like one of Lydia's bills. I was very happy that it could be utilized in a different way because the governor ended up putting in her budget a substantial amount of money to go towards the Maine Housing Authority's Rural Affordable Rental Housing Program, which is a wonderful program that promotes and increases the likelihood of developers to create affordable housing in rural areas, which is something that generally doesn't happen because the way they make money is they want to make the largest building that they can and pack the most amount of people that they can into it. And this makes it attractive to build housing units that are between 5 and 18 units. And it's always rented to people who are 80% or less of the median income. Often it's touted as low income housing, but I would like to throw out there real quick that 80% of the median income, I just did this math recently for a different town, for Wiscasset, I think. The median income in Wiscasset is about $59,000 a year. So that means it's people that are making really around $47,000 a year or less. We're not talking low income. We're talking workforce housing. We're talking regular people just trying to live. So I was very excited that a lot of money went to this program. And the once again, they work in the committees. I believe Representative Stover is on the Housing Committee. We were able to use my bill as a vehicle to make some changes to the program itself in order to make it more effective and to be able to reach more people. We're able to loan more money out at once to have more projects going, which would have been a major issue. We were able to tweak the law. So if there is affordable housing and it was in danger of being sold and turned into not affordable housing, that now, excuse me, municipal housing authorities or the Maine State Housing Authority has the kind of right of first refusal to get in there and swoop up that property and keep it as affordable housing. So I'm very excited about that. And not to go off on a tangent, but it goes right along with my next bill, I think. 1276, yes. Oh, that's okay. 1276 has been carried over. I wasn't able to get the money I needed this time. Originally, this started as a much larger, more comprehensive bill, and through all of our work, we've narrowed it into something that is going to, I think, potentially really help with the affordable housing crisis. The bill as it is now gives a financial incentive to owners. It's a little bit of capital gains tax relief, essentially, when sold. There's a lot of mom and pop owners of mobile home parks in the state. Many are trying to retire over the past, since 2020, I want to say 70% of our mobile home parks have been sold to large out-of-state real estate developers. They're typically absent. Oftentimes they are hiring companies for management that are not doing what they need to do. I'll probably be writing an op-ed about Whippoorwill Hill Mobile Home Park sometime soon, those of you in Wiscasset. So this little bit of money gives incentive. It's not a lot. It's maybe $10,000, sometimes 15 in the grand scheme of selling a whole mobile home park. But it's enough to maybe make them hold off and allow the residents the time that they need to organize and create a resident-owned cooperative, which studies and experience show time after time is creates better places to live. It allows people to own their own homes, which is the American dream, right? And things get fixed quickly because the people who live there are the people in charge of getting things fixed. Anyways, I'm very excited. I'm hoping I can get this funded next year. It's got a small fiscal note. We'll see. Oh, yes, 1829. So I have a big problem with the price of prescriptions. The predatory prices of prescriptions. It's really horrible. I did a ton of research and I found a really great model policy that has to do with tying the price of prescriptions to the prices negotiated by Medicare, because finally Medicare is able to negotiate prescription drug prices as they, I won't go into my feelings on that. I think that should have been happening for a long, long time. Anyways, because that can happen, if we can create a way for this, for our statewide insurance companies and our private insurance companies to be able to capitalize on that same negotiation price, it would be able to reach a lot more people, and it would be slow at first. I mean, it's only 10 drugs in the beginning, but it's the drugs that cost people the most and cost insurance companies the most, especially in our state as well. I think it would make a really big deal on for people who are just trying to afford to live. So I'm excited about this one as well. I do have an ask for this one since you're all here. If if anybody knows any really fantastic constitutional lawyers who would like to write letters about how this doesn't not violate the dormant commerce clause of the Constitution, which it does not, please give me a holler, send me an email, maybe just put me in touch. But those are the ones I'm excited to be working on next session.
Yeah, so as those are getting pulled up, the process for constitutional amendments to the Maine state constitution is that they start as bills in the legislature as resolutions, and then they have to pass 2/3 in both the chambers, the House and the Senate. So this year, there were 4 constitutional amendments that passed in the legislature by those 2/3 votes and are now on the ballot, because the next step before a constitutional amendment is officially added to the Constitution is that they need a majority approval by voters. So we don't need to approve them by 2/3 anymore like the legislature did, but we do need to approve them by a majority of people who show up in the November election. Oh, so we can, Kelly already introduced me, but if you want my email, it's there. I can send it around later too. It's just lane@lwvme.org. So the League of Women Voters, I see familiar faces in the room. So you all probably know this, but we're nonpartisan, member-based organization. And, you know, our mission is to empower voters and support democracy. So let's see, that's our website. Feel free to check it out. All right, as I said, there's 4 constitutional amendments on the ballot, and they're getting way less media attention and just sort of general coverage, I think, than some of the citizen initiatives, of which there are also 4. So we're just going to go through them so you all have a sense of what they are asking you to vote on. We can go to the next slide. I already said this, but they have to pass in the legislature, and then they need a majority approval by voters. We can go to the next one. So the constitutional amendments on the ballot are going to be the last 4 questions. The first 4 are going to be the citizen initiatives that you're probably hearing a lot about. So they are questions number 5 through 8, and I'm just going to run through them. And if folks have questions, I can try to answer them. I am not a constitutional lawyer. A lot of these are also like fairly, I don't want to say mundane because some of them are important and we can talk about it, but they're less controversial than some of the other things on the ballot. So number 5 is, do you favor amending the Constitution of Maine to change the time period for judicial review of the validity of written petitions from within 100 days of the date of filing to within 100 business days from the date of filing of a written petition in the office of the Secretary of State, with an exception for petitions filed within 30 calendar days before or after a general election? I know. Absolutely. So what that means, we can go to the next slide where we can actually figure out what that means, because it's a very wordy question, is that the Secretary of State's office is understaffed and under-resourced and overwhelmed. And it's an enormous task for them to go through the petitions that get filed for things like citizen initiatives, of which we have 4 this year. And so this originated to give them a little bit of a bigger window to do the process of confirming those petition signatures. So it's 100 days to 100 business days. So it's no longer counting those weekends. And also, if a campaign that gathered, they have to gather like 68,000 signatures. If they decided to just dump those signatures at the Secretary of State's office within 30 calendar days of an election, when the Secretary of State's staff is occupied with administering the election, they would get sort of an exemption to that 100-day window within that 30-day time frame. So there would be a little bit of a buffer of when they would have to start that 100-day clock. So again, this is just riveting, but you can tell kind of the way I'm saying it, it feels a little biased, but it sort of originated out of the Secretary of State needing more time. They either need more time or more staff. So this solution is more time. So that's question 5. And so question 6 is, do you favor amending the Constitution of Maine to require that all of the provisions of the Constitution be included in the official printed copies of the Constitution prepared by the Secretary of State? And we can go to the next slide. So since 1875, 3 sections of the Maine Constitution have not been included in printed versions. And one of those sections is the treaty obligations that Maine inherited from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts when it became a state. So those treaty obligations, although they are still legally in the Constitution, they are not in the printed version, along with 2 other sections that are a little bit more about when the legislature originated, etc. So what this constitutional amendment would do is it would restore those sections to the printed version of the Constitution. And when we get to the end, I'll talk about like who is supporting these, because there are some organizations, including the League, that have positions on some of these constitutional amendments, and this one in particular. I think you can talk to Kelly about it as well. But yes, so that is what question 6 is. And so we can go to question 7. So 7 is, so these last 2, actually 7 and 8, are constitutional amendments that would bring our state constitution in line with court decisions. So there's already been federal court decisions that have invalidated parts of our Constitution. And these constitutional amendments would now change those unconstitutional parts of the Constitution. So this one is, do you favor amending the Constitution of Maine to remove a provision requiring a circulator of a citizen's initiative or people's veto petition to be a resident of Maine and a registered voter in Maine, requirements that have been ruled unconstitutional in federal court. So we can go to the next slide. So again, this is just saying that a petition circulator for something like a citizens initiative doesn't have to be a Maine resident or a citizen to be a petition circulator in Maine. And again, this is just bringing our Constitution in line with a court case about that very issue, where the court said, hey, this is in violation of the federal Constitution. So as it is right now, if you are a non-resident, you can be a petition circulator, because the old part of the Constitution that was ruled unconstitutional is legally unenforceable. But this would change it to, I get a little confused as to why we have to do that, but it's the process by which every constitutional amendment has to be approved by voters. So even the ones that are ruled unconstitutional still have to get that approval from us to be officially changed. All right. And then the last question is another one of these originating out of a court decision. Do you favor amending the Constitution of Maine to remove a provision prohibiting a person under guardianship for reasons of mental illness from voting for governor, senators, and representatives, which the United States District Court for the District of Maine found violates the United States Constitution and federal law? So we can go to the next slide. So again, this one is amending our state constitution to be in line with that court decision, to say that people under guardianship can vote, which so they're legally allowed to vote right now, but our Constitution is outdated. So we need to sort of amend it to bring it in line with that court case. And so those are the 4 constitutional amendments on the ballot. And I was trying to sort of do a little research ahead of this presentation, and we've been doing this research for Vote 411, which is our online voter guide as well. I was trying to look into who are the proponents and opponents of these constitutional amendments. And honestly, I couldn't really find many opponents, at least organized campaigns spending money. So I'll say that the League of Women Voters of Maine, so my organization, officially supports question 6 and question 8. So question 6, again, was the one about printing all parts of the Constitution, including the treaty obligations. And question 8 is about rectifying the fact that our Constitution still has language in it banning people under guardianship of mental illness from voting. So the League has an official position in support of those. The Wabanaki Alliance, and again, you can talk to Kelly more about this because she's very involved in it. They are supporting question 6. That again is the treaty obligation question, and they are running a bit of a campaign about it. So if anyone wants to volunteer, here's maybe a pitch for that. They're doing some canvassing and phone banking, trying getting the word out about it. Disability Rights Maine, another statewide organization, they're supporting question 8. And I couldn't find any opponents that were sort of publicly talking about these constitutional amendments. So the Secretary of State publishes a guide to the referendum questions, and there were no public comments opposing any of these constitutional amendments in that guide. Now, the legislatures might have heard things in committee, but it seems like, and I looked up the roll calls, it seems like most of these were very uncontroversial. So, I'm trying to sort of be educational here, and if there was sort of other perspectives, trying to at least represent those to you, but I didn't really find any. So I don't know if anyone has questions or if we have time for them, but.
So we do have time. For questions for any of our panelists. So anybody in the room, put your hand up if you would like a question. I can bring you the microphone because we have to use the mic so people at home can hear you. I do have one question for you, Lane, really quickly. You mentioned that questions 7 and 8 are designed to bring our Constitution in with federal court orders. What happens if they are defeated at the polls?
So as it stands right now, our Constitution, at least those sections of our Constitution, are legally unenforceable. So if someone who's like under guardianship for mental illness votes, the Secretary of State can't do anything to prevent them from that, even if our Constitution says it, because there's an injunction from the court. So unfortunately, I think it would just have to go back to the legislature and then back to the ballot again. And in fact, that guardianship question was voted on previously because the court decision is from 2001, I believe. So like it was voted on, I think, and failed. So it's being brought back. So sometimes this takes a little bit of time and awareness raising among voters. But yes, I'm not a lawyer, but I I think that's what would happen. It's just that there would be another try at it.
So I have a question about question 8. So in the definition of mental illness, does that incorporate all of developmental disabilities, or is it specific to only people who experience mental illness?
So I think that the term like under guardianship for mental illness is the term in the Constitution, and I'm not sure how historically it was applied. I think it was applied to people with intellectual disabilities as well as people with mental illness. There's different types of guardianships, and I'm not an expert on them. But yes, I think despite the phrase mental illness being the language, I think it was used more expansively to prevent a wide range of people who were, according to that Constitution, deemed, ineligible to vote.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions here? And then we'll go to Zoom.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for all the work you're doing. This is great stuff. It's great. My question has to do with, I think, 1975, the decriminalization of scheduled substances. I think I know the answer, but would appreciate confirmation. There are ceilings on the amount of these scheduled substances that one could hold, for which that possession would be decriminalized. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So we have possession laws, we have furnishing, and we have trafficking laws, and each of those are determined by quantity of substance. So this would only be the possession of individual use of those scheduled substances. So the trafficking and furnishing laws would remain the same, which is the shared belief in we don't want drugs coming into our state, right? I'm not looking at legalizing drugs, right? This is very different. It's saying that a person in possession of their own drugs for their own use would not face criminal charges.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Good evening. My question to you would be, what are some of your most difficult things that you had to deal with in this legislative session? And that goes for everyone on the panel. You could, but brief. Who wants to start?
I think that having 2,300 bills, approximately 2,300 printed bills, with the amount of time, which was 6 months, that became 7, with approximately 700 carryover bills right now. And they've said that we need to hear all of the carryovers in January. January, is it now 90 days long? So it was the amount of work that we laid before us. And I think that people did an incredible amount of work to get through most of those. We had the hearings, and some of them we had to carry over for a variety of reasons, but it was the number of bills and the amount of work to do a good job on that.
I don't mind going next. I think the most difficult thing this session for me was just the sheer quantity of things I've learned in the past year. I mean, just being on committees, for example, I know more about pogies and the banking system than I ever did in my life. Being on the chairing the Marine Resources Committee, and then being on the Health Coverage Insurance and Banking Services Committee. Yeah, figuring out the right people to go to, the best ways to get support for my bills and move things forward. I love learning, so it's great, but the quantity, I'm not gonna lie, it was difficult at times.
And I'll echo if anyone has any questions about getting your culvert replaced and how the DOT will or will not do that. That's my latest constituent issue. All right, I know a lot about that. The most difficult thing for me was coming into my second term. I sort of knew a lot about how things worked, and we had this phenomenal budget, right? The largest state budget of all time. And so the sense was we're flush with resources. We should be able to do everything, right? Thus the 2,300 bills with great ideas, with amazing funding initiatives. But here's what being a legislator means, that revenue forecasting tells us that in the next 2 years, our state budget is going to look very different. And I presume that most of us will still be involved in one way or the other. And when we create programs that need ongoing funding, who in this room wants to be the one to have to cast the vote to cut that program, right? So there is this fiscal responsibility that comes with our job that means making really tough decisions about not funding phenomenal programs when it feels as though we have the money, right? The largest rainy day fund in all of history. We have, and our budget has gone to show that we have made some really significant financial commitments to amazing programs. But as Holly said, we're also still looking at a huge number of bills that are carried over with this hope of, can we fund more? Can we do more? And the problem is that there's not that funding stream coming down the road. And so to be responsible to our neighbors and to our children in the state of Maine, right? I've heard horror stories of what it was like under our former administration of the cutting, right? Of passing budgets when there was no money. And so it was hard choices. And so making sure that we're passing good policy that we can fund in an ongoing way so that we don't have to return to Augusta and say, now it's our job to slash everything, right? Now it's our job to disappoint our constituents. And I'll just plug one little thing, the property tax program. So for folks who have followed, the property tax stabilization program seemed like a great idea. We passed it last session. I heard from a lot of constituents who felt very passionately that freezing their property taxes over the age of 65 was really important to them. It meant they could stay in their home. It meant they had more financial security. It meant a lot of really good things for their future. What it also meant was a price tag of upwards of $100 million per budget cycle moving forward. And that's not a price tag that our state can manage for that stabilization program. So the legislature said, okay, actually, we're going to cancel that program, right? We're going to pull that back, which was a hard vote to take, but I think folks understood it. And what we said is we really want to help support a deferral program. So for folks in financial crisis, the state will pay their property taxes until that estate is processed, and then the state will be refunded what they paid, right? It allows people to stay in their home who are facing the most financial hardship, and we're going to increase qualifications for the property tax credit. So what we said was, instead of broad sweeping policy that has a huge price tag, we're actually going to narrow that down to try to help support the folks with the greatest level of need. And that's disappointing, right? It's probably disappointing to some folks on this call. It's disappointing for people who really saw that program as something that we were going to commit to. And I don't like that. I don't like making a commitment to our constituents and then having to roll back on that. And so budgets, money, like, these are big responsibilities. And I think we all take it so seriously because it's really designing the future of the state of Maine. And we want to do that with good fiscal health.
That was an outstanding answer. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Lydia, because one of the questions I have, and I guess this would also include Lane, I think, a lot of the things that we want to do as progressives, and not all Democrats are progressive. There are a lot of people who are on the moderate side. We have to be able to work together. This is a legislature that is pretty closely divided in the House. And so you need, and a lot of our legislation requires 2/3 to pass. So there's compromise. And I understand that a lot of that happens in committee. But I'm wondering, let's think of a positive story where there was a bill that came forward that initially wasn't going to get support that was bipartisan, and yet it ultimately did that. Is there an example of that that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, our highway fund budget was phenomenal. So the highway budget has been funded through bonds, often $50 million for a 10-year cycle with a $15 million interest note on it. It's a huge cost to the taxpayers of Maine. And we know that this budget, right, the thing that funds our roads and our bridges and our infrastructure, our ferry system, has been in crisis, and we just keep patching it with these bonds. And Maine voters have been really supportive, right? Over 70% of Mainers have supported transportation bonds. So it's gotten us through. And this year, the Republicans brought to the Transportation Committee a proposal to lock in $100 million per biennial budget out of the general fund. So taking that out of the general fund budget and putting it into our highway fund. That $100 million comes directly from the sales and use tax for vehicle purchases. So it was a natural consequence in my eyes of, this is a policy of maintaining a tax on vehicles that are purchased and registered in the state of Maine. They can be out of state, but registered in Maine, and putting that money into maintaining the infrastructure that those cars depend on. And this was a hard negotiation. It's $100 million out of the general fund. The general fund being that pot of money I was just talking about that funds really amazing, phenomenal, progressive priorities. So we were basically saying, we're going to take $100 million. We're not going to bond. Right? We want to be financially responsible. We want to use the money that we have well. And, you know, roads cover this entire state. It is a great equalizer and allows commerce. It allows social infrastructure to be maintained. It does a lot for our communities. And so that highway fund budget was bipartisan coming out of transportation and had possibly unanimous support. I don't even remember the vote by the time it came out. So it was a good experience.
Well, but I'm wondering too, from the League of Women Voters, which is a nonpartisan organization, and yet there are bills that you do take a position on. And some of those bills might be more heavily favored by one caucus over another, but can you share a bipartisan example of something that you've supported that you've been able to see people come together on, if not this cycle, then before? And the reason I'm bringing this up is, you know, we have our values, we have our viewpoints, and there are things that define us. And there's some of these values that we're just not willing to set aside. But there are ways to accomplish values, policies that can create a place to work together. And I think that's something we're going to be hearing a lot about next year in the campaign cycle.
Yeah, so the League of Women Voters, you know, we're nonpartisan in that we never endorse candidates, but we do have policy positions and we do support legislation. As you saw from the 2 constitutional amendments that we support, we can take positions on ballot questions sometimes. I didn't follow this process as closely as some of my coworkers, so I'm not sure I can say how bipartisan this was, but something that came up at the end of the legislative session was that, you know, all these bills pass and all these budgets get submitted, and then the Appropriations Committee has the job of just putting everything on the chopping block and being like, we have this amount of discretionary budget money and we're going to fund X number of bills from it. And that process requires a lot of negotiation. And one of the things that we were supporting that was up on that was, I think it was 2, it might actually have been 3 in the end, new positions for the Secretary of State's office. Because as mentioned, the Secretary of State's office is just chronically understaffed for the amount of work that they have to do. And we are asking them to do a lot more these days because we're asking them to implement a lot of pretty awesome things like online voter registration, which is going to go live next year, or ongoing absentee. And so again, these are new programs that they have to implement. So there's an increased sort of staffing need in their office. And so we worked with clerks and other organizations to really try to get the message to the Appropriations Committee that this was a huge need for funding, because it unfortunately kind of becomes a zero-sum game with all these bills. They all have their price tags. They all have their advocates. They're all, many of them, most of them are good programs or good policies. But I think that that committee really heard that message, and like we were really surprised that they funded that. Another sort of one related a little bit to the legislature is, and I was amazed that this passed and was funded, but the legislator salary increase. And that was bipartisan, at least I think in committee. I didn't follow it all the way through. Yeah. So for those who don't know, like legislators don't get paid very much at all. And so this was a bill that would slightly bump their salaries, still very underpaid for the amount of bills that they have to work. Yeah, 20,000 one year, 25 the next year for a 2-year term.
And that is up from, these people have been working for $14,000
Yes.
a year. I'm sorry, 14,000 and then 10,000. They've been working for $24,000 spread over 2 years.
Yeah.
That's what they've been doing. And now that will be, was it 35? Yeah.
Over 2
so
years. Yeah.
that's going to allow some people to run for office who couldn't afford to run for office before.
Which is
So-
why the league supported that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Holly just said, if you couldn't hear from him, Holly was saying that it allows some people to stay in office who were going to have to leave because they couldn't afford it.
Along the same lines, in the State and Local Government Committee, we had the governor's salary. And one of the things about the governor of the state of Maine, not Janet Mills, but the future governor of the state of Maine, is that we are the lowest paid governor. We have the lowest paid governor of any state, which was actually really embarrassing. And especially when the debate part of it starts to the conversation, it's like, are you really talking about $70,000 right now? And we passed it. It didn't very difficult to get unanimous support for much out of state and local government. We got enough votes to carry it forward, and it passed. And our future governor is going to make 120,000. Whoa. And that's still lower than some of the commissioners. Can you imagine being the CEO of a company, a very large company, and you're one of the lowest paid people, which is the truth? People are like, but she has 40,000 discretionary. I'm like, she has to eat lunch and dinner with a lot of people and clothes and all of it. Right. But she gets free housing. I'm like, it's not about her. It's about the future. So we did it. Those two things are really significant because we have people who are sitting in there who really suffer financially and add up a lot of debt just being a legislator because they can't do it. And then we have people who it will attract who can't afford to do it at $24,000. So it was a lot of process, but we did get it through, and both things are substantial and I think we'll change the face of Maine in the future.
So for those of you who think that running for office is not just the sexiest thing on the planet, Colbert's notwithstanding, the work that they do, it is you really can't put a price tag on it. I'm just really glad that they did raise that price tag just a little bit, because heaven knows you all have earned it. If there are no other questions, I'd like for us to give a round of applause to our speakers.